The last video is going to look at the effects of decolonization. So recapping the previous slide, in the last video, it's great these countries had self-determination. They had the right to govern themselves, and they had thrown at the shackles of that foreign influence from their imperial parent countries. But it doesn't mean that it's just going to be all rosy. The act of building a state, of unifying people together to create a cohesive government and a functioning economy is not something that just happens. And it's a hard process that we've seen play out over the last several decades. And it's had some success. It's had more success in some countries than in others. We look at countries in Southeast Asia and in parts of Latin America, we see noticeable success or limited success. And we look at countries in Africa, and we see lots of struggle to create a strong nation. So the process, just because they receive independence, does not mean it's going to be all great. And it leads to other types of problems. It's easy to be unified to throw off a foreign power, kind of like we saw with China getting rid of Japan. The communists, the nationalists joined together. But once you've gotten rid of that foreign power, then what do? And you find yourself with a whole new list of problems. Some examples here are just Singapore is an example of a city-state, became a nation that is incredibly wealthy, one of the major traders of the world today, and a huge player in the free market. But as a result of doing this, they've had some oppressive practices on their people, and they have a huge gap of the upper and the lower class that they need to deal with. India is a modern-day power, no doubt about it, but they've gone through a massive population crisis that has increased poverty, that has stimulated starvation as a result. They had to find a way to create more food, Green Revolution, and they've had to deal with several different religious conflicts between Hindus and Muslims, and as a result have broken into several different states after their independence from Great Britain. Ghana went through a peaceful process of gaining independence because they were not a settler colony, but after several years of rule with Kwame Nkrumah, the state was then redesigned and changed, and there's been several harsh political rulers that have ruled over Ghana. South Africa was independent technically in the 1940s from Great British rule, but still had a large settler colony still there that were the Afrikaners, that were the minority white that practiced extra abilities and rights over the African people living there ethnically and traditionally from Africa. And so we see these big racist actions, this small elite group of whites ruling over a larger group of blacks with apartheid, segregation at its worst. And in Vietnam, despite getting rid of foreign influence from France, the North and South Vietnamese go to war against each other and face more foreign influence from the United States in the Vietnam War. So it's just, these countries have a variety of problems they come against. Let's look at some big trends. First, Africa. Africa as a continent has had the most trouble becoming a stable governing body and economic body. Now, that doesn't mean in the future they will continue to have these problems. In fact, they are looking like they're set up to have more success, but they have major issues that other states don't have to deal with. One, probably the largest, is that the national boundaries, as shown on this map with these black lines, are arbitrary lines that Europeans crafted when they participated in the scramble for Africa. And those lines cut through different geographic regions and different ethnic and tribal groups. And what it does is it creates a state, because when the country became independent, they kept these black borders that is made up of multiple ethnic groups that really, if we practice the ideas of nationalism, should all have their own country. To make it even worse, these lines cut through, as you see here, and through most of these, cut through regions and parts of ethnic groups, and they separate them into two different countries. And those countries, what you have then is you have people who have had a similar way of living for most of their existence that are then separated by these borders and are living in different countries that could have different economic and political practices, yet they still have the same cultural identity and want to be united. So it makes it very hard to create a cohesive state, a cohesive functioning political body that's on the same page. This is part of why Pan-Africanism was so appealing initially, because instead of looking at these different tribal differences and saying that that's why we're all so different, let's just look at the idea of us being African and using that idea of our history of being members of this continent for many centuries as a way of identifying ourselves and promoting independence and identity. That worked well for receiving independence, but once the states became independent, ethnic and tribal differences sprang up and became issues that they've had a hard time dealing with. We've seen that played out in Rwanda, we've seen it playing out in Nigeria, we've seen it playing out in pretty much every African country, these ethnic tensions. Along with that, religion is often closely tied to certain ethnic groups, and you have a large number of people who practice some type of animist faith in Africa, or traditional African practice, polytheism, with one divine or God. You also have a large population of Muslims, you have a large population of Christians. Christians came over during European interactions, and in Ethiopia before that, and then the Islamic faith came over to the country during the trans-Saharan trade routes and trade on Swahili eastern city-states. Those faiths have been used to kind of put countries against each other and have been just kind of more of a dividing factor in ethnic groups that have led to more and more conflict. So people allowing their differences in the religious and their beliefs to cause conflict. Disease is a major issue in Africa, and the inability to get vaccines and aid to that state is a crisis that has gone on for many years. The rate that AIDS infects and kills people and malaria infects and kills people on this continent is exponentially greater than other continents. And it's a problem that is not going away, and it's something that many Western civilizations are feeling apathetic towards and are not necessarily fighting for assistance with this. Ebola is an example from this summer of another major pandemic with limited health care being given when it's absolutely needed. And even more startling is the number of large, valuable, well, Africa's full of natural resources. And it has...
Good morning, Eastridge. Welcome to April 16th. Your daily announcements will start here in 30 seconds.
Sorry about that. The announcements just came on. Try to pause them or silence them. The resources they have, the oil, the diamonds, things that are so valuable in today's society, they're usually owned by foreign companies. And so foreign companies can make a profit off of these goods at the expense of the African countries that need to make money from them. So despite having all these valuable resources, they actually don't have access to sell them and use them, which has been a major crisis for Africa. And has caused even more tension between European powers, the former imperial parent countries, and with the African country itself and the citizens that live there. There's a map of Africa highlighting the different ethnic tribes and national boundaries. Again, the black lines are the national boundaries. More effects. As countries become independent, we see more diffusion. People that live within the state that don't necessarily feel like they're part of the majority of the population want to create their own states, so they form separatist movements. This is seen in India, where after India's release from independence, Pakistan, or West Pakistan and East Pakistan is created, and you have a predominantly Hindu country in India and a predominantly Muslim country in Pakistan. This is bad just because you have people in Pakistan that are Hindu and you have people who are in India that are Muslim that are now the vast majority or minority of the population and are not going to have their needs voiced by the government, so they then want to leave. This causes mass exoduses and violence between different groups. And in areas where those faiths are particularly intertwined, you see lots of violence, such as in Kashmir. In Quebec, there's a separate movement that has existed since the 1980s when Canada became this Commonwealth. Quebec has ties to France and is French-Canadian speaking cities, and it's a French-Canadian speaking province. This is bad because most of Canada speaks English and has ties to British colonial rule and as a British Commonwealth state, whereas this part is more closely tied to France. And they feel that their traditions and ideas and needs are not being met by the government, so they want to separate and create their own state. This harkens back to the Métis, the ethnically mixed French-speaking and Native American groups in Quebec during Period 5, and also with Louis Riel, the activist for those Métis rights and separation of Quebec. So this has been going on for a long time. Even Canada's got problems. And then the Biafra movement, these are Igbos, an ethnic group in Africa that want to receive their independence because they feel that as a minority compared to the other groups, based on their beliefs, that they will be suppressed and not allowed to benefit in the government of Nigeria. This is in Nigeria. And so they separated and created their own country called Biafra. This then caused a civil war because the rest of Nigeria wanted to bring Biafra back, since Biafra, eastern part of Nigeria, is where all the oil is in Nigeria, and that's the major component of their economy. So they were forced to try and fight for them to come back, not because they wanted to unify them culturally, but because they wanted those resources. And even today in Nigeria, you can still see this flag in some areas secretly being shown as a sign of protest and the wish for a separate Biafra state for the Igbo people. The Cold War influenced these new nations because they were developing countries that could be swayed to one type of political or economic system. And so the United States, Soviet Union, China, other countries all hopped in to try and influence their identities. Some countries played the solidarity card. They will ride the middle, they'll be non-aligned, and that's Egypt and India. They pushed their own movements at the expense of not getting involved in this global superpower conflict. Other countries were victims to proxy hot wars, where like the United States would send aid to fight against communist forces, and the Soviet Union would send aid to fight against capitalist democratic forces. And this would be like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, any issue in Latin America, Afghanistan, all these places where foreign aid is given, but the two powers, Soviet Union and United States, are not fighting directly. We see superpower influence over the government. In Iran, the United States appoints a leader who will embrace democratic, capitalist, and secular practices in the government. This is Shah Reza Pahlavi. And he's eventually overthrown by the Iranian people during the Iranian Revolution in the 1970s. And he's replaced by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and they then bring in a government that brings back Sharia law and more fundamentalist practices. Korea experiences this Cold War superpower influence, North and South Korea, North being influenced by China, South by the United States. China, at different points, is closely tied to the Soviet Union, then it's not tied, then it's more tied to the United States and Western countries getting involved in its socialist market economy. And then Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Cuba are all countries that have tried to expel foreign U.S. influence to limiting success. Guatemala tried to expel it. Ultimately, the ruler was replaced by a pro-United States businessman who then encouraged the United Fruits Company to keep making and controlling the economy in Guatemala. Nicaragua, with the Sandinistas, has gone through several different revolutions and has people put in power that are more aligned to socialist practices but are trying to be replaced. And Cuba has appointed a military dictator, Fidel Castro had, who then pushed out U.S. influence and created a state that was communist that was tied to the Soviet Union. These are all examples of more protests to Cold War involvement, people being against the use of nuclear weapons, students protesting involvement in foreign wars, the American civil rights and black nationalism. This is kind of looking more at the Western nations. They were trying to spread democracy and contain communism, but they would question within their own countries, like Dr. King, Malcolm X, how great are these democratic systems, because we have people in this country who have limited civil liberties. We need to address these civil rights, such as freedom of equal jobs, equal opportunities, equality. This needs to be addressed. This is done in the 60s with the civil rights movement and the feminist movement. So these are two big parts of it. Nonviolent approaches of protest, satyagraha with India, but just finding ways of getting a message across through civil disobedience and not actually fighting. And then movies and pop culture identify the conflict as entertainment, but also a scary thing to be aware of. We see with James Bond. This guy here is Thich Quang Duc. He is a Buddhist monk in Vietnam, and he's protesting U.S. involvement in the South Vietnamese government before the Vietnam War began. And he is self-immolating himself. He's burning himself. He's lit himself on fire to protest these actions. People had to look away. He's not hurting anybody but himself, but he's also causing a great scene and a very iconic image. This is similar kind of the ideas of like Guernica, or having a famous painting as an example of protest to political conflict and practices. Fundamentalism, one of our last big ideas we're talking about, is a movement that rejects modernism, secularism, and trends that challenge one's own religious truths. This happens in India, especially in Kashmir, with the BJP party, who are fighting to bring back all of the Kashmir region under Indian influence and not having it split between Pakistan and China and India. Iran, Afghanistan, and Saudi Arabia all practice Sharia law, this traditional form of law in the Islamic world, and the Halifs. America, we see far-right Christian groups that practice really reactionary types of ideas. In Israel, we see far-right parties that promote the complete removal of Palestinian forces within Israel and want no compromises with Palestinian states. Now, these ideas aren't negative things. They can be if they're taken to an extreme and they're violent, but they also can be positive for trying to create unity and nationalism. Examples of religion being used in government that had positive effects would be Desmond Tutu in South Africa, Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States, and Oscar Romero in El Salvador, trying to speak up for the needs of people who disappeared. Last two slides. Affects migration from former colony to imperial states. Algerians. After Algeria became independent, we see a massive amount of Algerians that were ethnically French and also ethnically Algerian migrate to France. We see that with South Asians going to Great Britain and other Commonwealth states of the former British Empire. And many Filipinos, as well as other people from Southeast Asia, other nations, have also migrated to the United States for new opportunities and ties to their former colonial powers. And then population resettlements. People are forced to migrate because of the new lines that are drawn due to partitions and separatist movements. We see Israel created in what was Palestine, which then forced Palestinians to move to other parts of the area, such as the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And in Sudan, Darfurian are forced to flee away from Sudan to other countries because they are being persecuted and killed by the ruling powers that are there.